Hi, my name is Angie Hypes, and my presentation is about something that I'm very passionate about, and that is breaking the stigma that surrounds mental illness. It's a very persistent issue that we experience in our society, and so I wanted to further explore how we can break the stigma that surrounds mental illness and encourage individuals to get appropriate treatment. When completing my paper, there were different topics I wanted to review in efforts to make a clear and concise recommendation to break the stigma associated with mental illness. I wanted to define mental illness so that I could have a better understanding of what having that diagnosis means. I also wanted to explore the history of mental illness to show that stigma surrounding mental illness has been present for hundreds of years. I also found it was important to define stigma as it related to mental illness and identify the types of stigma one may experience so appropriate interventions could be implemented. I took the opportunity to highlight the impact stigma can have on an individual with mental illness so one can have an understanding of how detrimental it can be and how it can deter one from seeking treatment. While completing my paper, I was able to identify interventions to resolve this issue through a literature review and an interview with Rebecca Stone, Director of Treatment Services with Seneca Health Services. Based upon the literature review and interview, I was able to make appropriate recommendations on the interventions needed to break the stigma associated with mental illness and efforts to encourage individuals to seek appropriate treatment. Mental health and well-being are fundamental for quality of life. They are the basic elements of social cohesion, productivity, and peace and stability in the living environment. Individuals who are diagnosed with a mental illness face daily struggles, which can be just as chronic and debilitating as physical conditions. However, many individuals who have a mental health diagnosis don't seek treatment due to the negative stigma attached to that mental illness. Due to the stigma attached to mental illness, mental health problems are often underestimated, underdiagnosed, and untreated. The term mental illness is defined in different ways and varies across individuals and cultures. Culture influences mental health challenges and disorders, and mental health services in many ways. A mental disorder or mental illness is a diagnosable illness that affects a person's thinking, emotional state, and behavior, as well as disrupts that person's ability to work or carry out other daily activities and engage in satisfying relationships. The term mental illness is usually used to refer to severe mental health problems. There are different types of mental disorders, some of which are more common, such as anxiety and depression disorders, and some are which are not as common, such as schizophrenia or anorexia. Though mental illness can be defined in various ways, it's important to remember that it becomes an issue when it impacts one's daily functioning. Historically, mental illness was directly tied to religion, in which round holes were put in the skulls of individuals who were thought to have a mental illness in order to let the evil spirits out. In the Middle Ages, there was a continued belief in the supernatural model. Therefore, society used different methods to rid that person of evil. Those methods included exorcisms, torture, death by fire, and starvation. By the 16th century, hospitals for the insane began to develop, in which treatment was usually cruel and inhumane. And as more and more individuals became to fear other individuals who had a mental illness, so did the number of asylums. During the 1960s, however, asylums and institutions were closed and individuals were integrated into community settings. The Community Mental Health Centers Act, passed in 1963, encouraged the deinstitutionalization process and mandated the use of community health centers. Though the deinstitutionalization process had many benefits, such as a reduced number of individuals who are in the hospital setting, it also had its downfalls, which included individuals just not being prepared to live and function independently in the community because they weren't familiar with that lifestyle. So upon release into the community, individuals lacked the support they needed from society and was often rejected by the community. Because these individuals were shunned by their community, they often turned to crime to support themselves. So this led to the use of community health centers. And the idea for community health centers for the mentally ill was to provide a better opportunity for individuals to integrate into society. There's not really one correct method of treatment or standard of treatment for individuals with mental illness. However, treatment is not going to stop the misinformation that often leads or creates the stigma. It's important to define stigma as it relates to mental illness so that we can understand the impact it has on an individual seeking treatment. Stigma refers to a combination of perceived dangerousness and social distance. It can be defined as a process involving labeling, separation, stereotype awareness, stereotype endorsement, prejudice and discrimination, and context which social, economic, or political power is exercised to the detriment of members of a social group. Corrigan and Penn consider stigmas as negative and erroneous attitudes about these persons. Mental illness for an individual can be challenging. However, when stigma is added into the equation, it poses a different level of challenges and issues. Stigma can originate from many facets, which leads to several different types of stigma. For this paper, I reviewed several different types of stigma and how they play a role in the lack of treatment received by those with a mental illness. These types of stigmas include anticipated stigma, experienced stigma, internalized stigma, perceived stigma, and treatment stigma. Anticipated stigma involves the anticipation of personally being perceived or treated unfairly. The belief that prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyping will be directed at the self from others in the future. Individuals living with mental illnesses who anticipate stigma expect that others will judge them and devalue them based on their diagnosis. On the other hand, rather than anticipating the stigma one might endure with a mental illness, individuals often actually experience stigma firsthand. Experienced stigma is the personal experience of being perceived or treated unfairly and is detrimental to those who experience a mental illness and can cause emotional distress and hinder recovery. This type of stigma can lead to withdrawal and restriction of social support. Individuals may not only experience stigma from others, they also may stigmatize themselves. Individuals who are experiencing or perceived to have a mental illness are often subject to negative stereotyping and biases from many sources, producing many negative effects. Such individuals frequently suffer from additional harm as a result of internalized stigma. Holding stigmatizing views about oneself is known as internalized stigma. This type of stigma has been associated with a number of negative outcomes, including increased depression, avoiding coping, social avoidance, decreased hope and self-esteem, worsening psychiatric symptoms, and decreased persistence in accessing mental health services and other supports. Opposite of internalized stigma is perceived stigma, which refers to the views about the extent to which people in general have stigmatizing attitudes, behaviors towards people with mental illness. Public perception plays an integral role in the formation of stigma. While stigma on its own can be regarded as a direct social judgment about a person, perceived stigma concerns the expected reaction of others and is therefore relevant for people with psychological disorders who want to be open about their disorders. This is especially true with regard to how the general population influences how the public reacts to those suffering from mental illnesses and what their attitudes towards them are. Because of these reactions from public, treatment stigma is often seen. Treatment stigma refers to the stigma associated with seeking or receiving treatment for a mental illness. An individual with a mental illness may defer treatment because of the ideas and judgments which accompany it. Stigma has their roots in many different areas and are reinforced in several ways. The media has one of the largest impacts on society's views of individuals with mental illness. The media often portrays people diagnosed with mental illnesses as violent, who should be feared. These labels and stereotypes reduce the dignity and alienate those individuals with mental illnesses. Increasing evidence suggests that significantly greater barriers exist to the receipt of mental health care in comparison with physical health care. Worldwide, more than 70% of young people and adults with mental illness do not receive any mental health treatment from their healthcare staff. When individuals delay or avoid formal care, this can have problematic consequences. The stigma associated with mental illness may be an important factor for reducing treatment. A lack of knowledge of causes, symptoms, and treatment options of mental disorders and a lack of personal contact with persons suffering from these disorders can lead to prejudices and negative attitudes toward them. Individuals suffering from mental illness often are recognized as strangers who are not allowed to find an adequate place in society. When investigating processes of stigmatization of people with mental illness, it is important to understand how it can happen that individuals who need help, support, and integration are often rejected and excluded. A primary instinct to survive as an individual could lead to the avoidance of others. A feeling of insecurity arises when recognizing the mental instability and vulnerability of a mental ill person, which often leads to the division amongst individuals who do and do not have a mental illness. This is also known as social distancing. Social distancing can occur between individuals based on the severity of the mental illness and the assumptions of the dangers that may accompany a mental illness. Research shows that individuals who are familiar with mental illness were less likely to believe the population is dangerous, and it also showed that these individuals were found to be less afraid of mentally ill. Research indicates that people who are in need of help often fail to use helping resources because it represents an open admission of inadequacy. Even in children, the stigma associated with mental health treatment is a major barrier in receiving professional help. Social stigmatization and negative feedback from family and friends are a potential inhibiting factor in seeking treatment. Individuals with a mental illness face many challenges adapting to life in a society that does not fully understand them. Often the effects of the stigma that they face are overwhelming. Individuals who have a mental illness not only have difficulties at home or work, but in all aspects of their life, such as relationships with others. Having a mental illness causes a person to undergo much stress in their daily lives, many to the point of total disability. Many people are reluctant to seek professional help or treatment because they feel uneasy, ashamed, or believe that seeking help is a weakness or failure. According to many studies, people seek help from relatives and friends, and last, by professionals. They are reluctant to reveal their problems to others because of fear of social rejection, social isolation, and hostility. Individuals with a mental illness often have a difficult time fighting the stigma as the illness itself. So in this paper, I examined several different methods of intervention which could be examined in efforts to reduce stigma related to mental illness. It was difficult to narrow down the intervention methods because of the different types of stigma associated with mental illness. One approach to reducing stigma associated with the mental illness is enhancing training methods and procedures of mental health professionals, and that's basically through education. Educational anti-stigma interventions present factual information about the stigmatized condition with the goal of correcting misinformation and contradicting negative attitudes and beliefs. An example would be an education campaign to counter the idea that people with mental illness are violent murderers by presenting statistics showing that homicide rates are similar to among people with mental illness and the general public. Educating the public about mental illness can help reduce stigma. Studies show the more information provided, the greater the understanding of individuals diagnosed with mental illnesses, therefore creating a greater level of acceptance. Younger populations, the more educated, and those with previous exposure to people with mental illnesses tend to have more enlightened views and have more accepting attitudes about mental illness. Older individuals who tend to be less knowledgeable seem to want more social distance, and really they have developed more stereotypes about mental illness. Attempts to increase awareness of mental illness have shown to be effective in reducing stigma and perceived violence. The education approach to reducing stigma is focused on challenging inaccurate stereotypes by replacing them with basic factual information. Professionals believe that this can be accomplished by addressing mental illness to any audience, simply by stressing the falsity surrounding typical mental health claims. With better understanding of mental illness realities, individuals will less likely to endorse stigma, discrimination, and more likely to dispel the myths. Based upon my research and interview with a mental health professional, it's apparent that stigma associated with mental illness has a significant impact on an individual's decision to seek appropriate treatment. When mental illness is severe enough to impact one's daily living, it can make life more challenging. However, when that individual feels they are experiencing stigmatization because of the mental illness, it can be detrimental. Historically, individuals with mental illness have been stereotyped and discriminated against. Individuals with a mental illness received barbaric ramifications for something they couldn't help. These individuals were often shunned and forced to fend for themselves, which often led to criminal activities. Society moved towards integration of individuals with mental illness through the evolution of community mental health centers. Though these centers were developed, stigma remained present, and negative attitudes continued to gravitate towards those with a mental illness. Education interventions can take place in any location, including rural areas, through collaborative community efforts. Local mental and behavioral health centers can provide information and education through media campaigns in their area. Once an individual seeks treatment, they can continue to provide education to the individual through therapy. Educating an individual with a mental illness through therapy can assist that person in how they perceive themselves and how others perceive them, which can reduce the stigma one feels they are experiencing. Based on the research and practice issues of therapy and the barrier of negative stigma on positive outcomes, It is apparent that the most effective effort to reduce stigma is through an education component. Once an individual feels encouraged and empowered by the education obtained through mental health literacy and media campaigns, then therapy-based services can be utilized to address any internalized stigma and other types of stigma one may be experiencing. Education should be focused on reaching out to all society through mental health literacy and media campaigns. These education components appear to be a key component to breaking the stigma associated with mental illness. When information provided to society is factual, heartwarming, and relatable, attitudes regarding mental illness appear to be more positive and accepting. As we have become more distant in our interactions, relationships, and socialization, we have been less compassionate towards others with differences such as mental illness. However, this negative stigma has been recognized, and many are working towards educational programs that identify the differences and acceptance of those who fall within these areas. This public education will continue to be a benefit to those who suffer with mental health issues and other differences. For individuals with mental illness and who are feeling the negative stigma, their treatment should include an education component regarding self-image, acceptance, and understanding of differences. I recommend education programs should be presented to children and adolescents so they have the confidence as they grow and develop into strong adults. Therefore, if they should have a mental illness, then they would have the required skills to feel confident and strong. Furthermore, mental health literacy campaigns should also be presented to the general public and to individuals who may be established in their beliefs about mental illness and efforts to change their negative and judgmental views.